Well, good morning and welcome, everyone. Jim Brett of the New England Council. And I hope everyone had a very nice weekend and continue to stay safe and healthy. I also want to hope that everyone that in the next couple of days can relax and at least have a very small and safe Thanksgiving celebration this week. But in the meantime, we are so thrilled that you all have been able to sign up for this great program this morning. It's one of the largest attendees that I've seen in quite a time. And before I introduce Congressman Neal, I want to quickly remind you of several other council events that we have planned in the next couple of weeks. We have several more Capitol Hill reports scheduled beginning next week. Well, it's really in December 9th. We will have Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut speaking, Congresswoman Catherine Clark, the newly elected Assistant Speaker of the House, on December 14th. And then we will have on December 16th, hopefully, maybe the new chair of the Appropriations Committee, if all things work out for her, Rosa DeLauro, will be speaking to the New England Council. What a great lineup. And we hope that all of you will tune in, because these are just terrific speakers. But today, we are just delighted to welcome back the Dean of the New England delegation, my good friend, Congressman Richie Neal. Believe it or not, the council's first virtual event was held back on April 1st. And guess who our guest speaker was? Congressman Richie Neal. Since then, we've had dozens and dozens of these programs with members of Congress, governors, federal agency leaders, and just many more people. But at this critical time in our nation's history, we're just so grateful that the congressman could take time to join us again. As many of you know, he was just reelected to his 17th term, representing the 1st Congressional District here in Massachusetts. And I might add, not only reelected, but reelected by double digit. So I'd like to think in his district, they didn't count the votes, they weighed them. He's extremely popular in his district. In addition to serving as the dean of the congressional delegation here in New England, he's also the chairman of the most influential House committee, I believe, and that's the Ways and Means Committee. And why? It has jurisdiction over everything from taxes to trade to healthcare and retirement policy. And we have gotten more questions for the congressman today than for any other speaker that we've had. And that is because it involves all of these areas: healthcare, retirement policy, trade. I mean, you name it, it's in his committee. And we're blessed to have him there with the gavel, to say the least. So I know that we're all eager to hear from him about the prospects in the next couple of weeks in the lame duck session, and then also maybe the prospects of something good happening in the new Congress, and then his insight on the incoming Biden administration. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce the Honorable United States Representative for the 1st Congressional District, my good friend, Congressman Richie Neal.
Thanks, Jim, very much. And thanks to the New England Council membership. I've always looked at Jim Brett and the New England Council as sort of the ballast to give me a lot of very important information. And always recall that that's one of the most important things that Congress does, is to gather information to make informed decisions, how essential that is in our day-to-day responsibilities. But also, I like the idea that at the New England Council, that there's always been within that ballast a careful balance of competing interest for our region. And I can't emphasize how important that is. We are geographically the smallest region in the country. We punch firmly above our weight. As Jim mentioned, you have the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. You now have the assistant speaker, and you have the chairman of the Rules Committee, and you have a contest with Rosa DeLauro, who could be the chairman of the Appropriations Committee. And New Haven is about maybe 65 miles from Springfield, and I know Rosa very, very well. And in addition to that, you have John Larson in Hartford, who is a very influential member of the House of Representatives and a former chairman of the Democratic Caucus. So I think that for those of us who like describing institutional matters. That's a pretty impressive bevy, I think, of individuals who hold prime spots in the congressional leadership, as well as being leaders across the New England delegation. One of the things I'm very proud of is that every member of Congress from New England, they received their first committee request. And since committee assignments are destiny in Congress, and again, I know it's hard for press and others to focus on this, but still, as Woodrow Wilson noted, the real work of Congress is driven by committees. And having individuals in the room with Speaker Pelosi or Leader McCarthy or Majority Leader McConnell or Charlie Schumer, or for me to have been in that Oval Office a number of times with President Trump, it's a reminder of just how important these committee assignments are. So let me give you a take on where we are with the transition. I think that this is being reported accurately about President Trump's reluctance, reticence, refusal to concede the result of the election, where he's now down by between 6 and 7 million votes on the popular side and well down on the Electoral College. And yesterday I attended in Springfield an event that we have hosted for more than 50 years. And that's a commemoration of the assassination of John Kennedy, who actually had been nominated for the US Senate in Springfield in '52. And I call attention to that because during my remarks yesterday, I pointed out that when we awoke the morning after the election, 60 years ago now, in our household, one of the first things we witnessed was Richard Nixon offering a very gracious note of concession. And while there's no constitutional provision for concession, it does help considerably the new president-elect to get underway with not only his team, but just as importantly, it gives a level of confidence to the system in which we've all just participated in with record turnouts everywhere. And remember John McCain's gracious concession to Barack Obama, Al Gore's gracious reception. Even though it took 7 weeks, that was a different contest based not upon fraud or arguments about fraud. Instead, it was an argument about how votes have been counted in the state of Florida. And the Supreme Court decided 5-4 that George Bush would be the president, and Al Gore accepted it. And I think it would be very helpful right now for the wheels of government if President Trump would simply point out that Vice President Biden has won the election. And I note that the vice president is proceeding on the basis of making cabinet secretaries appointments this week. I think that's a good thing. The problem is that he can't get access to some national security issues, international security issues, because you would need the GSA to certify, in fact, a lot of the technology, but you also would need the president to signal to his cabinet secretaries and others in the federal bureaucracy that they should begin to cooperate with the new president. Barack Obama pointed out over the weekend that George W. Bush could not have been any better in helping to smooth the way to a successful transition for him. So in the election, I think it's fair to say we were surprised in the House by losing anywhere from 7 to maybe up to 9 seats. There are still a handful to be counted. But in any respect, it looks as though we will have a very small governing majority. Now, for the critics who have watched some of the battling back and forth between the moderates and the more left, what you need to keep in mind, it also could make us a more cohesive party because the speaker will not be able to afford to lose members. And in addition to which, I think that those 2 Senate seats yet to be decided in Georgia, while it's still a bit of a climb for Democrats, I think that's a fair statement, that Joe Biden brings a remarkable institutional leaning to the challenges in front of the country. He's an internationalist. America should lead the way. We should rejoin Paris Climate Accords. We should rejoin the World Health Organizations. no threat or temptation to suggest any longer we would conceivably leave NATO. And I think that you should be able to look to his appointments as, frankly, people that I would be very confident in. I would share Biden's view of the institutions of governance. Our system was built upon not lurching in any sudden direction. And the result is that I think in the case of Joe Biden, that those relationships that he formed over a long period of time in the US Senate will be very helpful. I also would say that if you read the transcript, as I did a couple of weeks ago, Mitch McConnell's farewell address thanking Biden for his service, I hope that that will also be a precept for the way that relationship will play out. There are a series of issues in front of the country, not the least of which is the pandemic. And until we defeat the virus, it's going to be hard to figure out how we get to a full economic recovery. And even though we have now regained about 12 million of the 22 million jobs that were lost, that still leaves 10 million people on the sidelines. I'm very proud of the Ways and Means Committee's authorship of the CARES Act. It saved the American economy. We were trying to buy time. The Speaker, myself, and Secretary Mnuchin were on that line on a Friday night from about 7 till midnight, and we went back and forth on the parameters of the CARES Act. My congressional district alone, 10,400 businesses took advantage of the Paycheck Protection Program. Our hospitals all received allocations of money, given the fast-moving nature of the pandemic. We intend, I hope, to do that again with another round of stimulus checks. And remember Speaker Pelosi's position after we passed the follow-up subsequently to the CARES Act, known as the HEROES Act, which I know many of you are interested in. But in the HEROES Act, it was $3.4 trillion, which she has said she would move to $2 trillion on. But she wants to shorten the duration. So it would absolutely give Joe Biden a chance, as he should get with any new president, first of all, to pick his appointees. That latitude's important, but also to draft legislation based upon the evidence of the moment after he's inaugurated. So her proposal would be to take us until the end of January. So I think that that we really need, in this time of emotional stirrings as they relate to the election, to point out that it's time to get on with the work of the federal government. And the other part of this would be the following. Outrage now will move to the more conservative side of news media. Remember, outrage always serves the party that's out of power best in terms of media consumption. And the 24-hour news cycle has not been helpful. Social media have not been helpful. And many of the talk shows have been not helpful. But this pandemic is serious. 12 million people have been affected. And not to miss the point that 250,000 people have died. I talked with Governor Baker on Friday. We talk all the time about this aid package. And he knows I'm pushing very hard to get an accord. He's very interested in state and local government assistance, as am I. And I know a couple of questions that were posed relate to that. But the governor has indicated time and again how grateful he is for the CARES Act. And he wants to move on to a version of the HEROES Act. So I think that those are imminently doable and achievable events. Just a couple of other interests that I have here. I think we need to reset the trade agenda. Recall that Massachusetts is at least 1/3 dependent economically upon international trade. I think keeping the heat on China is important, but simultaneously, tariffs are not the only way to do it. There are other ways to do this. And I think that recharging that relationship, which is the most important bilateral relationship on earth, is essential. I led the negotiations, as you know, on USMCA, the largest trade agreement in the history of the world. And we were able to get 195 Democrats to vote for that trade agreement. 194 Republicans voted for it. It was endorsed by the Chamber of Commerce and the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters Union. So I think a reset of our trade agenda, less emphasis perhaps on tariffs and more emphasis on international cooperation and multilateral relationships, makes the most sense. I think that Our economy in Massachusetts is special. We always seem to rebound a little bit faster. And I think it's because of our educational institutions, our hospitals, the research that takes place in the state, agricultural interest, manufacturing, you name it, we have it all. And I think that the last point I'll make on this is the American people are looking to the federal government for some achievements. And I still measure government by success. You can have all the ideological battles you want to have, but guess what? If you're not changing the lives of the American people through legislation, you're sort of at a standstill. The last point before I take a couple of questions, Jim, is we've really been on the cutting edge, in the vanguard of retirement savings. The Secure Act, which was written by the Ways and Means Committee. I've had a long-standing interest in retirement savings, dating back to my earliest days on the Ways and Means Committee. I will tell you with some humor that my first bill was to raise the individual retirement account contribution from $2,500 to $5,000. And knowing that Chairman Rostenkowski did not like IRAs, it immediately raised my name recognition. 2 years later, we did it. And I've repeatedly pushed for making it easier to enroll, making it harder to opt out, and making sure that the tax code favors retirement savings. So the Secure Act was the most important advance in 15 years. Now Secure 2.0 is going to have a steady growth opportunity. Whether or not we do that in the lame duck session, it's ready to go, by the way. Kevin Brady and I have reached an agreement on all of it. And if not, we'll do it right after the first of the year. So I think that, I think being able to wait until you're 75 years old for the minimum distribution is going to highlight the idea that people are going to work longer and they're going to need better opportunities to save more. And those catch-up provisions that we built in for people over 55, those are really good. So those are some of my interests. There'll be a series of tax matters, trade, tariffs. I think that there'll be some Social Security issues, certainly Medicare, and management of pensions. I'm going to push hard, very, very hard, to help out with the multi-employer pension plans as well. And you've had a great model there with Local 25, the Teamsters over there in South Boston. They've been terrific. Manulife has been very helpful on that. And we've got to do it. That's the reality of it. So with that, Jim, be happy to take a couple of questions.
Great. Some of them you've already answered, but maybe we'll give you a chance to expand on. One of the big issues that you're going to have to face in the next month is the stopgap, whether we're going to have the federal funding, I think, runs out on December 11th, doesn't it? So will we have another stopgap measure, or will we have an agreement?
Yeah, I've talked to Speaker Pelosi on this. I would prefer an omnibus. Let's put history behind us, get on to a new administration, embrace the 117th Congress. The problem with the CR is it means that you revisit it again in 2 or 3 months, and the tension, the polarization is all right in front of us again. So generally with an omnibus, there's a day or two of tough stories, but whether we like it or not, it's one of the ways that you have to do federal budgeting right now, given the polarization of the American people and the closeness of Congress and the battles over the executive branch. So I prefer, by the way, to use that for Biden's temporary spending measure as well. I think that's an excellent vehicle. Let's attach some state and local government relief, hospitals, stimulus checks, and do something of a compromised version of what we did with Heroes. But December 11th is a big date. We go back on Monday, and we're having these conversations. So again, in the Speaker's office, I think last Thursday, I talked to her about that.
And Secretary Mnuchin asked Chairman Powell in a letter last week to end the facilities that the Fed stood up with money under the CARES Act. And I think that involves maybe the governor would be interested in that, state and municipal lending programs, as well as, I believe, the Main Street facilities for businesses. What will Congress do in the new Congress?
Well, I think that Secretary Mnuchin is wrong on that. And I've expressed that to him. I think that Jay Powell has done a really good job at the Fed. And I think the Main Street lending program, we wish would have been more effective or more efficient. That didn't happen quite the way that we wanted. But this is the wrong time to take tools away from the Federal Reserve Board for the purpose of trying to constrain the new administration. And I think that President-elect Biden is going to have considerable regulatory authority to revisit this. And if not from this pocket, other pockets of cash at the federal level, so that that will be refurbished. I sought Powell's advice as I developed the CARES Act. I think that that's well known. And I thought that then and now, I thought Powell's done a really good job. And we're lucky to have the Federal Reserve Board president in Boston that we have. I think Eric Rosengren does a terrific job.
And just another tax policy. Mr. Chairman, with the new administration and the divided Congress, can you give us your current view on tax legislation? You held a number of hearings regarding items that need to be fixed in the tax bill. You think that will happen? You think there'll be an effort to repeal items? And how will your counterparts in the Senate respond?
Well, I think that there's going to be some room, but of course, tax policy is hypercharged all of the time. But there are some corrections that are going to have to be undertaken. I'm reluctant, largely because of the job I have, because I know that if I say something, it conceivably moves markets right away. So I'd be a bit guarded in what I have to say about how we intend to proceed. But there are some issues that they're interested in the Senate side and that I'm interested in on the House side. I've actually had a good working relationship with Senator Grassley. We have similar interests, even though they were geographically separated. And I think that those conversations were really important. I spoke with him about 2 weeks ago, invited him to send some measures over to me, and I was going to send some measures over to him. And he comes from that same institutional memory that I do. So I think that some of these things can be accomplished in a lame duck session. And I also think structurally, the Secretary of the Treasury has considerable guidance ability. You will often watch a dispute between congressional intent and executive interpretation of what we meant. And I think in the case of Secretary Mnuchin, that the new Secretary of the Treasury will have, at my request, considerable flexibility, even as it relates to some of the PP protection loans and some of the PPE and on the tax measures there. I said to Steve Mnuchin, the congressional intent here was maximum feasible flexibility. So we have an opportunity to legislatively fix some of these measures. We also have an opportunity, as you know, Grassley and I are in agreement on these changes. So if you have the chairman of the Finance Committee who's a Republican in the Senate, and the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House is a Democrat, it strikes me that either it'll happen with this secretary, it'll happen with the new secretary, or it could happen with legislation. I think it's very likely that Congress will take this up as a priority.
And do you think the Democrats and the Biden administration would support rejoining the Trans-Pacific Partnership, particularly after China and 14 other Asian Pacific nations just finalized the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement?
Well, I think that what's happening in the Pacific, given China's South China Sea's behavior, coupled with what they're doing in Hong Kong and the threats to Taiwan and what they're doing with trade practices as it relates to Australia, it means that we need to pay more attention to this. And I think one of the ways to do it is to once again embrace multilateralism. So I am of the opinion, I've talked to Bob Lighthizer, the US trade rep, whom I've had a good relationship with. You should know that. And I think he's done a good job. And Bob Lighthizer and I worked for a year on USMCA. And he shares my views on enforcement. And somebody said to me, a reporter from the New York Times, Emily Cochran, she said, you know, Mr. Chairman, when did you realize that you could get an agreement with Bob Lighthizer? And I said, when I found out he worked for Bob Dole, we'd get a deal. And it was a deal that we on the Democratic side are very proud of. And I think in the case of Bob Lighthizer, I've talked to him about proceeding again to TTIP. That should be on the radar screen, because I think that a European agreement would get China's attention. The problem with TPP, as I expressed to President Obama in his office, The problem with TPP was wage rates in Vietnam. And it was a huge issue. I can't tell you how contentious it was. It ended with not only no agreement, but it ended up with no enthusiasm for an agreement. So I do think the bilaterals we've had in Asia, including Australia and others, those are bilaterals. But I do think that confronting China through a multilateral agreement with European Union makes a good deal of sense. And now given Brexit as well, that's a continuing issue as well.
Mhm. Got a question here from a nonprofit. As you know, individuals with disabilities can work productively as evidence in the work they do at the Springfield Federal Courthouse. I'm asking you support funding for individual with disability and the direct service professionals that support them in the next stimulus bill.
Well, I would support it. And as you know, I'm in that spectacular courthouse that
I know you
I
are.
earnestly worked on for 10 years to make sure it was done.
Yeah. Maybe that'll be the Neal Federal Courthouse someday.
But whatever it is, it seems to me as though it's it speaks to a very quaint time in Congress. I mean, we had a Republican president, but a Democratic Congress. And again, one of my important considerations there was that Steny Hoyer oversaw construction of federal courthouses. I thought I had a shot.
You had more than a shot.
But we needed one here. The GSA recommended it. Judge Mike Ponzer, the federal district court judge at the time, there was a bullet that was sent through his window in the old courthouse coming from the federal highway. And Moshe Safdie built a spectacular courthouse. For any of you who have seen it inside and outside, it is something to behold.
Question on the PPP loans. These questions relate to the IRS ruling that establishes the non-deductibility of business expenses paid for with PPP loan funds that are forgiven. Undoing this ruling seems to be something to which there is agreement by both parties, both houses. The PPP deductibility provision did not make it into the stimulus bill that passed in the suspension last summer. Where does passage of this stand? How confident are you that it will be enacted so that businesses can reap the full benefit of PPP loans as Congress intended when it passed the CARES Act? If a PPP deductibility provision does not pass in 2020, since businesses will not be filing 2020 tax returns until 21, might it be something on Congress's agenda for 21?
For sure, and I'm optimistic we will fix it. I think that the secretary in this case is mistaken on interpretation of congressional intent. And what's interesting is that Chuck Grassley, Ron Wyden, myself, and I believe Kevin Brady, we're all on a letter suggesting to the secretary, you knew what the intent was, you need to abide by it. And so we'll follow up on this willfully and assertively, I can assure you. It's important to remember when we did this, that we knew what our intent was, but we were also trying to buy time. And then the pandemic was raging and we wanted flexibility, and we informed the secretary of such. So it's one of the first conversations I intend to have with the new Secretary of the Treasury, which we will likely get to know in the next few days.
That's right. Someone in the financial service asked if we ask you the question, are you willing to move the Butch Lewis Act? And if so, when?
Well, I've moved it twice successfully. It has a broad support. It's not just a union issue, although it's oftentimes been described as a union issue. It affects a lot of independent contractors as well. So when it passed the House of Representatives with every Democrat voting for it, we also picked up 30 Republicans. And President Trump told me in the office he was going to do something about it. Mitch McConnell said he would do something about it, and that did not happen. But I'm optimistic in the Biden administration because I talked to Joe Biden about it. And I also talked to many of the people that looks to me as though they're going to be sitting in the Oval Office with him. We've passed it twice. And I think that for those that are perhaps novices that are on the call here with us, you might want to think of it this way. If you're in a retirement plan that collapses or is in jeopardy and you're 23 years old, you've got plenty of time to do the reset. Not so much when you're 75 years old. And this problem with the multi-employer plans, about 1 out of 10 are in trouble across the country. They are not in trouble because of corruption. They are not in trouble because of malfeasance. They are in trouble because of mergers and takeovers and fewer employers being positioned to contribute to the plans. This has support from the Chamber of Commerce as well as the Teamsters Union, but we were able to pick up a series of Republicans, as I noted a moment ago, largely based upon need. A lot of independent trucking contractors who are not unionized, they have the problem in states like Kansas or Nebraska, for example. So I lobbied very hard behind the scenes to get those members on the Republican side. It's a big Ohio, Michigan, Indiana problem, but it's also a problem around here. And as I noted, I think it's Local 25 with the Teamsters over in South Boston.
Mr. Chairman, you've long advocated for an infrastructure bill and recognized that broadband should be part of it. As the pandemic continues, more and more of our lives have shifted online, keeping us connected to work, school, healthcare, financial services, friends, and family. So the need and sense of urgency for connecting everyone has become abundantly clear. Generally, how do you see an infrastructure package evolving? And more particularly, as a member representing Western Mass, we know that you have an interest in getting broadband to all rural areas. Would funding for rural broadband be included in an infrastructure project? And do you have any thoughts for resolving the rural broadband issue?
Well, the rural broadband is a critical issue because I think it's a way to bring along some red state congressmen. There are parts of the country, rural areas in particular, that don't even have 911 service. And I think broadband is an issue for those of us in the hill towns of Western Massachusetts, although Governor Baker's been very helpful. And Jim McGovern and I think Bill Keating on the Cape, he would also raise similar interests. I think that highways, roadways, bridges, airports, sewer and water, and certainly broadband, and for me, the issue of rail. I think that Biden's all in on a big infrastructure plan. I think we have to recognize what it means. I was talking to the head of Massport just a few days ago, and we had this conversation. But I do feel very strongly that our infrastructure has fallen into a state of disrepair. American Engineering Society says they gave us a D+. I also think it's a small thing for you to pay some attention to, because I know the people on the call and yourself, Jim, you would be interested in this. The stalemate in Washington, the impasse in Washington, has not been helped by the end of earmarking. And we know what our districts need. And the requests for congressional spending overwhelmingly come from hospitals, universities, and state and local governments. The last one because of the match. So my own belief is that a return to earmarking, fully transparent, would be very helpful to the conversation. Now, Steny Hoyer, who's a pretty good legislator, he indicated at the end of last week that there will be earmarking. Now, I want to tell you candidly here, the private conversations about earmarking with the Republicans have always been far better than the public conversations. And there is a interest over there in returning to it. I mean, it's contributed to the stalemate. I mean, at one time you had to move legislative bills. And I'll just give you a kind of an impromptu civics lesson on this. If you are a Republican in the House of Representatives, what would be your interest in voting for a spending bill if you think that you had nothing to do with it? So I think one of the few tools that are available to the minority in congressional life, it's been the use of earmarking. As I look out the window here, the plaza here at the courthouse, the State Street, Union Station, across my congressional district, those requests all came from local government to do them. And I do think a return to earmarking, given the fact that Article 1 of our Constitution makes it pretty clear that Congress is responsible for congressional spending. And I will also share something else that I thought was very important. It came from Speaker Wright. He used to quote Speaker Rayburn. And he said that Speaker Rayburn was asked how many presidents he had served under. He said, none. I served with 8. And I think that's the answer. This idea that they have more wisdom about spending, it just makes it easier for them to bypass Congress. So count me in on a big infrastructure bill and earmarking.
And how high up on the list would that infrastructure be? I think the president-elect was talking about, obviously, the COVID pandemic funding, and then a stimulus, and then maybe infrastructure, or what?
I think you can attach the three. Treat infrastructure as stimulus.
Yeah.
You know, you can immediately begin to hire architects and engineers. The construction season is so short here in New England. It's gotten better though.
Mhm.
Technology's gotten better, and I think that could be ready to go right away. And Biden has indicated that he intends to do it. And I've talked to his team, and they say he intends to do it.
Mhm.
So my guess is that a big infrastructure bill. And if you remember the Green Act, I attached to the Moving Forward Act last year, which was the biggest infrastructure bill to clear the House of Representatives, 1.5 trillion.
Mhm.
It included a substantial down payment on climate change. I've
Mhm.
come to the conclusion that the only way that we're going to move an infrastructure bill with climate change included is to use some tax incentives that would encourage the fossil fuel industry to, as they're doing with the Mayflower initiative off of Cape Cod,
Mhm.
to embrace the renewables. There's a lot of that taking place, and I do think that that conversation needs to be assertive. So the Green Act was a big deal. We attached it to, as I noted, the Moving Forward Act. And let me point this out. In a visit to the Oval Office now almost 3 years ago, it was President Trump who volunteered $2 trillion.
That's right. Mhm.
We came in looking for 1.5 trillion when we met with him that morning.
Mhm.
And when he looked at me and said 2 trillion, I said, I'm in.
Yeah. Now, will we get bogged down again on how to finance it? Are you going to go with tax, the gasoline tax? Are you going to do like Larry Summers says, now is the time to borrow
Yeah.
with the interest rates as low as they are? Do you think they'll work that out before they put a package out there, the funding source?
We purposely did not put a funding source on the bill. And we did that, myself and DeFazio and Pelosi. And the reason we did not put a funding source on the bill is that would kill the conversation immediately.
Mhm.
Because the other side would just pounce. And then the conversation falls by the wayside. So I thought, pass the bill, let's get to negotiation and try to figure out how to pay for it. I think clearly borrowing is a major route. Jay Powell has said that he intends to, keep interest rates low for the foreseeable future. Again, that's a reminder, it's a bad time for savers, but a good time for borrowers.
Mm.
And I think that some borrowing, and there would be some other cost considerations here. But remember, in some of the red states, they don't want to pay tolling fees. I get it. So as the Ways and Means Committee develops the funding sources for this, I'm in. I also will say this, the conversations I had with Stephen Mnuchin, although Trump didn't follow up on them, they were really good. They were really, really good. They were prepared to put their toe into the water, for sure. And you need the president to step forward on funding.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. What's the outlook for extending or expanding clean energy tax incentives, whether it's in the lame duck or the new Congress?
Yeah, I'd say they're excellent. Chuck Grassley asked me how a number of those measures, he said, hey, do you want to tell me how those moved? He said, I'm not sure who to give credit to. And I laughed. And I said, you can give credit to me. And I said it with some humor, though, because I knew what those states need. And, the national principle says that we have to come to the aid of all parts of the American geography and all parts of the American family. So in Grassley's case, he had a number of issues that he was interested in. I have a number of issues that I'm interested in that are very beneficial to our region. And I intend to act upon them accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Will surface transportation reauthorization provide a vehicle to address serious climate change issues? The Green New Deal is unlikely to move ahead on its own, but elements could be included in the STP, maybe. And related, what is the chairman's thoughts on Governor Baker's regional TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative?
Well, the governor and I are in accord on this. He's also in accord on the issue of a big infrastructure bill. And I don't think I'm talking out of school. I think I've convinced him on East-West Rail. He's been pretty good on it. Mm-hmm. And the conversations have been pretty sturdy. So I also think that the Green New Deal is a worthwhile goal and a principle. But I also think that legislation to help take us to combating climate change can be found in that Green Act. I would encourage anybody who's on the call to review what the Green Act did as it relates to surface transportation. It is a darn good piece of work that the Ways and Means staffers put together over a year. Really, really well done.
I think this is a question from one of your relatives. Thank you for your many years of leadership to our Commonwealth and country. Our association represents approved special education schools that employ over 10,000 and educate nearly 8,000 students with diverse and often severe special education needs. About 75% of it is approved through special education schools, completely open with all kids on campus, and about 20% are in a hybrid learning. We are proud we are meeting the state's call for primary on-person learning, but we haven't had any state support to be open. PPE, funding, testing, purifiers. We are hopeful for federal relief for special education as these high-need students and staff are primarily on campus. Can you discuss your priorities for education funding, and in particular special education and future relief package?
Well, I'm in agreement with everything that the questioner has asked and could be more enthusiastic. And I was telling Jim earlier on a call, just as we were getting ready in the preliminaries, I was in Holyoke on Saturday morning for a funeral mass, and I was with David Bartley, former Speaker of the House. And over the Speaker's rostrum in the House of Representatives in DC is this magnificent quote from Daniel Webster. And Webster asks in the concluding one or two sentences, did we do something worthwhile in our time? Mm-hmm. You know, when I saw Dave Bartley, based upon the question that was just asked, chapter 766.
Yeah.
I mean, Dave Bartley drove that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And when I had a chat with him that day, I sat with him just for a while. He's been a big friend and good supporter. But you know what? When you look at what we did, you know, contrast that with what school was like when I was going to school.
Sure.
As it relates to special ed.
Yep.
And again, there are a lot of people, but Dave Bartley was the principal architect.
I agree. Healthcare question for you. It seems that you have a great approach on the surprise medical billing issue, which is prominent in your campaign, has been validated by the voters in your district. Do you see surprise medical billing moving forward, whether in the lame duck, or is it an issue for the new Congress?
Well, it was a prime mover in my campaign. My opponent used it against me, which I laughed. I thought if they had taken 10 minutes to review it, they would never have used it. It's a great issue. I support this idea of arbitration. I was mayor of Springfield. I know that arbitration focuses the mind. And you know, when you're down the home stretch of an arbitration battle, one of the things that sound staffers will say to you, just remember, we could lose. And that gets a better last best offer. So the arbitration example that I put together in the committee, which by the way, every Republican voted for on the Ways and Means Committee. And we're in a bit of a dust up with the Energy and Commerce Committee. I think I have the better approach. I talked extensively with Mark Meadows at the White House about it. And now with the change in administrations, I think it's likely if we can't reach an agreement in the next 2 weeks, then we'll have President Biden's staff weigh in with us. But the arbitration award that I want, I think should be the centerpiece of it. And it was widely supported by all medical groups, including the Massachusetts Hospital Association, the American Hospital Association, physicians, you name it. So I think the surprise billing plan that we put out on from the Ways and Means Committee, that's the one that I'm going to adhere to. And Speaker Pelosi's tried to be an honest broker on it, but I also think that she understands the merit of the argument that I put forward.
As you go around to the district, and in light of the second surge, the pandemic, are you hearing more and more concerns about the PPE? For
sure. I've taken calls on it repeatedly, even over the course of the last week or so. And I can't emphasize enough how back-footed America was on the issue of PPE. I would highlight the New York Times Magazine piece yesterday,
Mhm.
which points out the degree of difficulty that Bay State Medical had when Dr. Ardenstein spoke to Dr. Kerouac, who runs Bay State Medical. He called me. I live almost across the street from Bay State Medical Center. And Mark and I have been good friends for a long period of time. And the manner in which the federal agencies were going to commandeer that PPE is a great story. It takes about a half hour to read the Times piece. It's really well done. And my office got right into the middle of it. But I do think that we've learned a lot of hard lessons. I might put in a plug for this terrific company in Lee, Massachusetts that I was up to visit a couple of weeks ago, Boyd Manufacturing.
Mhm.
What a great job they did with it. And they're a small manufacturer, as I noted, family run, and they are looking clearly to take a bigger role. The New York Times story this morning about how better prepared we are for the next round of resurgence of the virus, that's important. It's hard to inventory ventilators, but the N95 masks and others, we really were hurting when it came to that issue. And the profiteering that took place on that too is something that I think we need to be mindful of. An 80-cent mask was being offered for $6 in the open market. That is inconsistent with American values.
Yeah, right. In healthcare, one thing we know as health plans is that our members and customers are looking for stability
Right.
during a very uncertain time, whether they get their health insurance from their employers, the exchange, Medicaid, Medicare, or Medicare Advantage. What do you view as the biggest threat to that stability?
Well, I mean, it's always going to be the issue of financing. And count me as a chief defender of Medicare. I think the Times article said I'm seen as a patron of Massachusetts hospitals, and I am.
Mhm.
They're arguably the best in the world. And I've looked out for those hospitals. But again, to those who are participating in this event, half the revenue for Massachusetts hospitals comes from Medicare. Half. It's staggering. I mean, when you talk about who's the biggest employer in Massachusetts, you ought to say Medicare. And then when you offer that other 10 to 15% for Medicaid, I mean, or if you're with the Sisters of Providence in Springfield, they're 85% dependent on Medicare and Medicaid. And if you go to Holyoke, they're probably closer to 90%. Bay State's got a stronger formula. We don't have the private pay base here that Boston hospitals have in terms of negotiating price. So count me as a guardian of Massachusetts hospitals in terms of research, NIH, all of those issues. It's a story I wish was better known. But I mean, we're what, the 14th or 15th largest state in the country? We're the second largest recipient of NIH dollars. I mean, why would anybody want to give up that? And again, you know, when Mr. Johnson signed the Medicare Act in '65, he actually signed it in Harry Truman's living room. And because Truman had called for universal health care.
Yeah.
And in Truman's library, which I went to visit, I wanted to see the pictures and I wanted to see the letter exchange, and I did. And Johnson knew just what he was doing. The challenge is that everybody was all in on Medicare because it was a kind of seen as an earned benefit. Medicaid never had quite the same political constituency that Medicare did. But when we expanded the Affordable Care Act, that's largely how we did it. And the Ways and Means Committee wrote much of it. We expanded Medicaid. And the other issue for people in Massachusetts to pay attention to is Medicaid has become long-term care in America. It was not intended for that. It was intended for people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. But 20 million more Americans today have health insurance because of the ACA. And we all should be really proud of it. And last point on that topic, Jim, every child in Massachusetts has health insurance because of the ACA. Staggering accomplishment. 97% of the adults have it too. And that was our goal. And now we need to build upon the ACA.
Mhm. Chairman Neal, it seems like the incoming Biden administration will be focused on addressing climate change in numerous different ways, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions, most modes of transportation, such as aviation. Companies with a footprint in Massachusetts, like JetBlue, they're very, very concerned and interested to know whether we're going to be using tax credits within the tax code to help grow the promising sustainable aviation fuel industry to help decarbonize aviation?
I think as I noted earlier, you're going to have to use the tax system to decarbonize. And I think encouraging people to move to the renewables is going to be based on some tax incentives, maybe a lot of tax incentives. But I've taken an interest in the issue you've raised because I've become better acquainted with it in the last few weeks and months. But I do think that that whole issue of weaning our airlines from the use of some jet fuels is important. And I've seen some really impressive renewable proposals as it relates to that. But again, in their infancy, they're going to need tax credits to get off the ground.
I think you've already answered this, but it's from a different perspective. We're very appreciative of your continued bipartisan efforts to improve the nation's retirement system. Secure 2 builds on one of your signature achievements in this Congress, the Secures Act. What might we expect the Ways and Means Committee to act on this bipartisan package?
Well, last time it passed the House, it passed it in April. And by the time it got to the Senate, it was almost November before they passed it. And I was reminded of George H.W. Bush's admonition that he was convinced that the United States Senate could slow down the aging process. There was no need of that. That legislation was ready to go. And we're ready to go on the next round. And I think that retirement savings is something we need to pay a lot of attention to, making it easier for people to save. Prescribed dollars being set aside at tax preferred rates. It makes a good deal of sense. And here's the number that people want to pay attention to today. The average Social Security benefit is $16,000 a year. That means half the people that receive Social Security in America receive less than $16,000 a year. It's about $320 a week. It's not enough to live on. And so I think retirement savings, tax favored, pension, personal savings, the bedrock guarantee of Mr. Roosevelt's genius called Social Security, it's critical. And I have been a defender of Social Security and will continue to be. If people know about the floor of benefits that they're guaranteed, the tax system should help them build toward the ceiling.
The end of 21, do you think you could come back to the New England Council and say, we did something on transportation, infrastructure, we did something on pension reform, we did something on climate change?
I do. And I think that part of this is going to be the temperament of Joe Biden and his institutional memory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that will be very helpful to the national conversation. But the thing I worry about now is that the outrage machine in America is always based on opposition. I mean, you have to be in the outs. They have to embrace outrage.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the system I came through is you're measured by success in governance. And the endless conflict on every piece of legislation, I hope will subside. But I also think that Biden is going to be an individual of some goodwill. And I think that there are probably a handful of Republicans in the United States Senate who are likely to give Joe Biden a hand.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, and just looking at the new Congress, knowing that the speaker has the slimmest margin since World War II of a Democratic speaker, how realistic do you think it is that the caucus, the moderates and the progressives, are really going to work together and embrace the issues that you just talked about moving forward in the committee?
Well, I think that the circular firing squad will not be helpful. And I want to say to all of them, if they spend 6 months in the minority in the House of Representatives, they'll be singing from a different hymnal.
Mm-hmm.
In the Senate, recall, by construction and architecture, every vote counts. In the House, unless there's a measure of comity, it's very hard for the minority to achieve much. And when I first went to Congress, I remember that the majority leader was Tom Foley. And he said to us, the new members, of which there are only 2 of us left in the House in 1988, he said, tomorrow you're going to cast your first vote as a member of the House of Representatives. Our candidate is Jim Wright. Need I say more? And nobody voiced any dissent.
Yeah. And I mean, all the political analysts said that the House, the Demis will pick up 10 to 15 seats, and they lost, I don't know, 9 and counting, a couple of them too close to call. Do you think it was because the Democrats were in some areas of the country being perceived as the party of the socialists, defunding the police, packing the Supreme Court, Medicare for all, Puerto Rico, statehood? Do you think that all those issues might have affected some of the Democrats that won just 2 years ago as freshmen in areas that President Trump carried?
I do. And I think that I'm in favor of a candidate having the right DNA for a congressional district on the Democratic side.
Mm-hmm.
I'm in favor of the big tent theory. And I also, I think Speaker Pelosi shares my view of this. What happened to us in Miami-Dade County is instructive. Now, that evening, I was doing a call for a member of Congress who asked me just to get on the line to talk about where we were. But I had taken a call from a pollster who I won't give up the name of, pretty reliable.
Yeah.
And the pollster said, "Mr. Chairman, bad news." And I said, "You're not going to tell me Biden's going to lose." And he said, No. He said, "Biden's going to be fine." He said, "But I've just looked at the numbers in Miami-Dade County. You could lose 2 congressional seats there tonight." We did not flip one of the 7 seats we contested in Texas. We lost a seat in Oklahoma. We lost a seat in South Carolina. And we have a seat that we should have won hands down in Iowa. So on the Senate side, Republicans, with the exception of Gardner in Colorado, we had a net pickup of 1. And I think that the hard part of this is that there are certain members of Congress that can cast any vote because their districts are so safe. But I also think taking a measure of those who can't do it is important. So the logic escapes me as to why we wouldn't want a Democrat in Tennessee or West Virginia who votes with the National Democratic Party 75% of the time, as opposed to a Republican who will vote with us 10% of the time.
Right.
It's a hard argument to have because newer members, they don't seem to appreciate this. And I'm pretty earnest about it. I never missed a chance to point out I have a gavel in my hand because the left and the center have supported me. We need them both.
It's a good point. Well, the hour is up, and I just want to thank the congressman for spending the hour with us. Look what we talked about: trade, tax policy, infrastructure, PPP, healthcare. And the reason why we talked about all these issues is because they're all in his committee. As I said, it's the most powerful committee, Ways and Means. So we just want to thank him for all his support. And, for the few people that don't know much about the congressman, he has a reputation of working across the aisle. And you just heard him speak highly about the Secretary of Treasury, Secretary Mnuchin, spoke very highly of the trade representative, Lighthizer. I mean, this is how legislation is made, having bipartisan support, not just talking to your own, but across the aisle. And you do it day in and day out. So your fingerprints are on so many pieces of legislation. It's not glamorous. You're not going to get a lot of tweets and a lot of reactions saying, "Hey, good for you that you're there doing all it," because it's really an unglamorous assignment. But someone needs to do it. Someone needs to work on the legislation. And you were modest about the USMCA. You worked in that bill where it began, where you had so many of your own colleagues against it, to making it a product where people like Sherrod Brown, who never hasn't voted for a trade bill in, 25 years, that said, "Richie, I like what you put in this bill." So, I mean, Chamber of Commerce, Sherrod Brown, AFL-CIO, that's all because of working across the aisle. And again, kudos to you and your ability to move legislation that affects so many of our constituents' lives. So with that, I just want to thank you for your service. Thank you, and look forward to working with you in the new Congress. And congratulations on your big win this past month. So with that, have a great Thanksgiving. I can't wait for our events to be back, person to person rather than the Zooms. But in the meantime, this is the way we do it. So I just want to thank you, Congressman. You've been always
Jim,
there.
thanks. Yeah. Thank you and the New England Council. You've been terrific in terms of your guidance. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. And to everyone listening, thank you for participating. I hope your questions were asked. And I want to thank all of you for your support throughout the year and wish you a happy Thanksgiving, a safe and healthy Thanksgiving.